The complete works of Swami Vivekananda, Volume 3. The Vedant in all its phases. Lecture delivered in Calcutta. A way back where no recorded history, nay, not even the dim light of tradition can penetrate, has been steadily shining the light, sometimes dimmed by external circumstances, at, at other effulgent, but underlying and steady, and shedding its luster not only over India but permeating the whole thought world with its power, silent, unperceived, gentle, yet omnipotent, like the that falls in the morning, unseen and unnoticed, yet bringing into glooms the very fairest of roses. This has been the thought of Upanishad, the philosophy of the Vedant. Nobody knows when it first came to flourish on the soil of India. Guesswork has been vain. The guesses, especially of the Western writers, have been so conflicting that no certain date can be ascribed to them. But we Hindus, from the spiritual standpoint, do not admit that they had any origin. This Vedanta, the philosophy of Upanishad, I would make bold to state has been the first as well as the final thought on the spiritual plane that has ever been vouched saved to men. From the ocean of the Vedant, waves of light from time to time have been going westward and eastward. In the days of yore, it traveled westward and gave it impetus to the mind of the Greeks, either in Athens or in Alexandria or in Antioch. The Sankhya system must the Sankhya system must clearly have made its mark on the minds of the ancient Greeks, and the Sankhya and all other systems in India that had that one authority, the Upanishad, the Vedant, in India too, in spite of all these jarring sects that we see today, and all those that have been in the past. The one authority, the basis of all these systems, has yet been the Upanishad, the Vedant. Whether you are dualist or a qualified monist, an Advaitist, or a Vishishta Advaitist, a Shuddha Advaitist, or any other Advaitist, or Dvaitist, or whatever you may call yourself, there stands behind you an authority, your Shastras, your scriptures, and the Upanishad. Wherever system in India does not obey the Upanishad cannot be called orthodox. And even the system of the Jain and the Buddhist have been rejected from the soil of India only because they did not bear allegiance to the Upanishad. Thus, the Vedanta, whether we know it or not, have penetrated all the sect of India and what we call Hinduism. Banyan with this mighty banyan with its immense, almost infinite ramification has been throughout interpenetrated by the influence of the Vedant. Whether we are conscious of it or not, we think the Vedant, we live in the Vedant, we breathe the Vedant, and we die in the Vedant. And every Hindu does that. To preach Vedant in the land of India and before an Indian audience seems therefore to be an anomaly. But it is the time, it is the one thing that has to be preached, and it is necessity of the age that it must be preached. For, as I have just told you, all the Indian sect must bear allegiance to Upanishads, but among this sect there are many apparent contradictions. Many times the great sages of yore themselves could not understand the underlying harmony of the Upanishad. Many times even sages quarreled, so much so that it became a proverb that there are no sages who do not differ, but the time requires that a better interpretation should be given to this underlying harmony of the Upanishadic text, whether they are dualistic or non dualistic, quasi dualistic, and so forth. That has to be shown before the world at large with this work is required as much in India as outside of India, and I, through the grace of God, had a great good fortune to sit at the feet of one of whose whole life was such an interpretation, whose life a thousandfold more than whose teachings was a living commentary on the text of the Upanishad, was in fact the spirit of the Upanishad living in the human form. Perhaps I have got a little of that harmony. I do not know whether I shall be able to express it or not, but this is my attempt, my mission of life, to show that the Vedantic school are not contradictory, that they all necessitate each other, all fulfill each other, and one has it where is the stepping stone to the another until the goal, the Vedanta, the Tatatvam Asi, is reached. There was a time in India when the Karma Kanda had its swan. There are many grand ideals, no doubt, in that portion of the Vedas. Some of our present daily worship is set is still according to the concept or preconcept of the karma kanda. But with all that, the karma kanda of the Vedas has almost disappeared from India. Very little of our life today is bound and regulated by the order of the karma kanda of the Vedas. In our ordinary lives, we are mostly Pauranikas or Tantrikas, and even where some Vedic texts are used by the Brahmins of India, the adjustment of the text is mostly not according to the Vedas, but according to the Tantras or the Puranas. As such, to call ourselves Vedikas in the senses of following the Karma Kand of the Vedas, I do not think would be a proper. But the other fact stands that we are all of Vedantist. We are all of us Vedantists. The people who call themselves Hindus had better to be called Vedantist. And as I have shown you, under that one name Vedantika come in all our various sects, whether dualistic or non-dualistic. The sects that are at the present time in India come to be divided in general into two great classes of dualistic and monist. The little difference which some of these sects insist upon, and upon the authority of which want to take new names as pure Advaitists or qualified Advaitists and so forth, do not matter much as a classification. Either Either they are dualistic or monist, and of the sect existing at the present time. Some of them are very new, and others seems to be reproduction of very ancient sects. The one class I would present by the life and philosophy of Ramanuj, and the other by Shankaracharya. Ramanuj is the leading dualistic philosopher of later India, whom all the other dualistic sects had followed, directly or indirectly, both in the substance of their teaching and in the organization of their sect, even down to some of the most minute point of their organization. You will be astonished if you compare Ramanuj and his work with the other dualistic Vaishnav sect in India to see how much they resemble each other in the organization, teaching, and method. There is a great southern preacher, Madhav Muni, and following him are great Chaitanya of Bengal, who took up the philosophy of the Madhavas and preached it in Bengal. There are some other sects also in the South India has the qualified dualistic Shaivya. The Shaivya is the most part of in the most parts of India are Advaitis, except in some portions of southern India and in Shillong. But they also only substitute Shiva for Krishna, for Vishnu, and are Ramanujist in every sense of the term except in the doctrine of the soul. The followers of Ramanuj hold that the soul is Anu, like the particle, very small, and the follower of Shankaracharya hold that it is Vibhu, that is omnipresent. There have been several non-dualistic sects. It seems that there have been sects in ancient times which Shankara's movement has entirely swallowed up and assimilated. You find some time a fling of Shankara himself in some of the commentaries, especially in that of Bhikshu. Vijnana Bhikshu, who, although an Advaitist, attempts to upset the Mayavada of Shankara. It seems there were schools who did not believe in this Mayavada, and they went so far as to call Shankara a crypto Buddhist, Pranchachalan, Chana, Pranchachana Bauddha. And they thought this Mayavada was taken from the Buddhist and brought within the Vedantic fold. However, that may be. In modern times, the Advaitists have all ranged themselves under Shankaracharya, and Shankaracharya and his disciple have been the great preachers of Advait both in South and in North India. The influence of Shankaracharya did not penetrate much into our country of Bengal and in Kashmir and the Punjab, but in the southern India, the Smartas are all followers of Shankaracharya. And with Varanasi as the center, this influence is simply immense even in the many part of the northern India. Now both Shankara and Ramanuj laid aside all claim to originality. Ramanuj expressly tells us he is only following the great commentary of Bodhayan. Ancient teacher abridged that extensive commentary on the Brahma Sutra, which was composed by Bhagwan Bodhayan in accordance with their opinion. The word of the sutra are explained. That is what Ramanus says at the beginning of his commentary. The Sri Bhashya, he takes it up and makes of it a some some shape. And that is what we have today. I myself never had an opportunity of seeing this commentary of Bodhayan. The late Swami Dayanand Saraswati wanted to reject every other commentary of the Vyasa Sutra except that of Bodhayan. And although he never lost an opportunity of having a fling at Ramanuj, he himself could not produce the Bodhayan. I have sought for it all over India and never yet have been able to see it. But Ramanuj is very plain on the point, and he tells us that he is taking the ideas and sometimes the very passage out of Bodhayan and condensing them into the present Ramanuj Bhashya. It seems that Shankaracharya was also doing the same. There are a few places in this Bhashya which mentioned older commentaries, and when we know that his guru and his guru's guru had been Vedantist of the same school as he, sometimes even more thorough, thoroughgoing, bolder even than Shankara himself on certain points. It seems pretty plain that he also was preaching anything very original. And even in his Bhashya, he himself had been doing the same work that Ramanuj did with Bodhayan. But from what Bhashya, it cannot be discovered at the present time. All these darshanas that you have ever seen or heard of are based upon Upanishadic authority. Whenever they want to quote a Shruti, they mean the Upanishad. They are always quoting the Upanishad. Following the Upanishad, there come other philosophies of India, but every one of them failed in getting that hold on India which the philosophy of Vyasa got. Although the philosophy of Vyas is a development out of an older one, the Sankhya, and every philosophy and every system in India, I mean throughout the world, owes much to Kapila, perhaps the greatest name in the history of India in psychological and philosophical lines. The influence of Kapil Muni is everywhere seen throughout the world. Wherever there is a recognition system of thoughts, there you can trace his influence, even if it be thousands of years back. Yet he stand there and shine gloriously and wonderfully, Kapil. His psychology and the good idea of philosophy have been accepted by the all sect of India with but very little difference. In our own country, our Nyayika philosophers could not make much impression on the philosophical world of India. were too busy with little things like species and genus and so forth, and that most cumbersome terminology, which it is a life's work of study, life's work to study. As such, they were very busy with logic and left philosophy of, to the Vedantist. But every one of the Indian philosophic sect in modern times has adopted the logical terminology of the Nyayikas of Bengal. Jagandish Gadadhara and Shiromani are as well known at Nadia as in some of the cities of Malabar. But the philosophy of Vyas, the Vyasa Sutra, is firm seated and has attained the permanence of that which is intended to present to men. The Brahman or the Brahman of the Vedantic side of philosophy. The Brahman of the Vedantic side of philosophy. Reason was either subordinated to the Shrutis, and as Shankaracharya declared, Vyas did not care to reason at all. His idea in writing the sutras was just to bring together and with one thread to make a garland of the flower of the Vedantic text. His sutras are admitted so far as they are the subordinate to the authority to the Upanishad and no further. And as I have said, all the sect of India now hold this Vyasa Sutra to be the great authority, and every new sect in India starts with the fresh commentary on the Vyasa Sutra according to its light. The difference between some of these commentators is sometimes very great, sometimes the text torturing is quite disgusting. The Vyasa Sutra has got the place of authority, and no one can expect to found a sect in India until he can write a fresh commentary on the Vyasa Sutra. Next is the authority in the celebrated Gita. Next in authority is the celebrated Gita. The great glory of Shankaracharya was his preaching of the Gita. It is one of the greatest works that this great man did among the many noble works of his noble life. The preaching of the Gita and the writing the most beautiful commentary upon it. And he has been followed by all founders of the Orthodox sect in India, each of whom has written a commentary on Gita. The Upanishads are many and said to be 108, but some declare them to be still large in number. Some of them are evidently of a much later date, as for instance the Upanishad, in which Allah is praised and Muhammadan is called the Rajasula. I have been told that this was written during the reign of Akbar to bring the Hindus and Mohammedans together, and sometimes they got hold of some words as Allah or Ilah in the Samvitas and made as Upanishad on it. So, in this Alopanishad, Mohammedan is the Rajasula, whatever that may mean. There are other sectarian Upanishads of the same species, which you find to be entirely modern, and it has been so easy to write them, saying that this language of the Samhita portion of the Vedas is so archaic that there is no grammar to it. Years ago, I had an idea of studying the grammar of the Vedas, and I began with the Orthodox to study Panini and Mahabhashya. But to my surprise, I found that the best part of the Vedic grammar consists only the exception to the rule. A rule is made, and after that comes the statement to effect. This rule will be an exception. So you see what an amount of liberty there is for anybody to write anything. The only safeguard being the dictionary of Yaska Yaska. Still, in this you will find for the more part but a large number of symbols or synonyms. Given all this, given all that, how easy it is to write any number of Upanishad you please. Just you have a little knowledge of Sanskrit, enough to make words look like the old archaic words, and you have no fear of grammar. Then you bring in Rajasula or any other Sula you like. In that way, many Upanishad has have been manufactured, and I am told that that is being done even now. In some part of India, I am perfectly certain they are trying to manufacture such Upanishads among the different sects. But among the Upanishads are those which, on the face of them, bear the evidence of geniusness, and these have been taken up by the great commentators commented upon, especially by the Shankara, followed by Ramanuj and rest all. There are one or two more ideas with regard to the Upanishad which I want to bring to your notice. For these are an ocean of knowledge, and to talk about the Upanishad, even for an incompetent person like me, takes years and not one lecture only. I want therefore to bring to your notice one or two points in the study of the Upanishad. In the first place, they are the most wonderful poems in the world. If you read the Samvita portion of the Vedas, you know, and then find passages of the most marvelous beauty. For instance, the famous shloka which describe chaos, Tama Asita Tamasa Gudam Agra, etc. When darkness was hidden in darkness. So on it goes. One read and feel the wonderful sublimity of the poetry. Do you mark this that outside of India and inside also there have been attempts to painting the sublime. But outside it has always been the infinite in the muscles and the external world, the infinite of matter or a space. When Milton or Dante or any other great European poet, either ancient or modern, wants to paint a picture of the infinity, he tries to soar outside, to make you feel the infinite through the muscles. That attempt has been made here also. You find it in the Samhitas, the infinite of the extension, most marvelous painting and placed before the reader, such has been done nowhere else. Mark that one sentence, Tama Asita Tamasa Gudam. And now mark the description of darkness by three poets. Take our own Kalidas, darkness which can be penetrated with the point of the needle. Then Milton's, no light but rather darkness visible. But come now to the Upanishad. Darkness was covering darkness, darkness was hidden in darkness. We who live in the tropics can understand it. The sudden outburst of the monsoon, when in the moment the horizon becomes darker and clouds become covered with more rolling black clouds, and so on. The poem goes. But at in the Samvita portion, all these attempts are external. As everywhere else, the attempts at finding the solution of the great problems of life have been through the external world, just as the Greek mind or the modern European mind want to find the solution of life and of all the sacred problems of being by searching into the eternal world, so also did our forefathers. And just as the European with they failed also. But the Western people never made a move more. They remained there. They failed in the search for the solution of the great problems of life and death in the external world. And there they remained. Stranded, our forefathers also found it impossible, but were bolder in the declaring the utter helplessness of the senses to find the solution. Nowhere else was the answer, but better put than in the Upanishad. Yato vacho nirvartante aprapya manasa saha. From whence words come back reflected together with the mind. न तत्र चक्षुर गच्छति न वाक गच्छति न तत्र चक्षु गच्छति न वाक गच्छति. There the eye cannot go, nor the speech reach. There are various sentences which declare the utter helplessness of the senses, but they did not stop there. They fell back upon the internal nature of man. They went to get the answer from their own soul. They became introspective. They gave up external nature as the failure, as nothing could be done there, as no hope No answer could be found. They discovered that dull, dead matter would not give them the truth, and they fell back upon the shining soul of man, and there the answer was found. तम एव एकं जनाथ आत्मनाम अन्या वाचो विमुञ् विमुञ्चथ. Known this Atma alone, they declared, give up all other vain words and hear no other. In the Atman, they found the solution, the greatest of all Atman, the God, the Lord of this universe, his relation to the Atman of man, our duty to him, and through that our relation to each other. And herein you find the most sublime poetry in the world. No more is the attempt made to paint this Atman in the language of matter. Nay, for it they have given up even all the positive language. No more is there any attempt to come to the senses to give them the idea of the infinite. No more is there an external, dull, dead material, spacious, sensuous, infinite. But instead of that comes sometime something which is as fine as even that mentioned in the saying. न तत्र सूर्यो भाति न चन्द्रतारकं नेम विद्युतो भान्ति कुतो अयमग्नि तमेव भान्त मनुभाति सर्व सर्वं तस्य भासा सर्वम् इदं विभाति. What poetry in the world can be more sublime than this? There the sun cannot illumine, nor the moon, nor the star. There this flash of light cannot illumine. What to speak of this moral fire? Such poetry you find now nowhere else. Take that most marvelous Upanishad, the Katha Upanishad. What a wonderful finish! What a most marvelous are displayed in that poem. How wonderful it opens with that little boy to whom Shraddha came, who wanted to see Yama, and how that most marvelous of all teachers, Death himself, teaches him the great lesson of life and death, and what has was his quest to know the secret of death. The second point that I want you to remember is the perfectly impersonal character of the Upanishad. Although we find many names and many speakers and many teachers in the Upanishad, not one of them stands as an authority of Upanishad. Not one verse is based upon the life of any one of them. These are simply figures like shadows moving in the background, unfelt, unseen, unrealized, but the real force is in the marvelous, the brilliant, the effulgent text of the Upanishads, perfectly impersonal. If 20 Jnanavalkalas came and lived and died, it does not matter. The texts are there. And yet it is against no personality. It is broad and expansive enough to embrace all the personalities that the world has yet produced and all that are yet to come. It has nothing to say against the worship of persons or avtaras or sages. On the other hand, it is always upholding it. At the same time, it is perfectly impersonal. It is the most marvelous idea, like the God it preaches, the impersonal idea of the Upanishad. For the sage, the thinker, the philosopher, for the rationalist, it is as much impersonal as an modern scientist can wish. And these are our scriptures. You must remember that what the Bible is to the Christians, what the Quran is to the Mohammedans, what the Tripi- Trip- Tripitaka Tripitaka is to the Buddhists, what the Zend Avesta is to the Parsis. These Upanishads are to us. This and nothing but these are our scriptures. The Puranas, the Tantras, and all the other books, even the Vyasa Sutra, are the secondary territory authority, but primary are the Vedas, Manu, and the Puranas, and all the other books are to be taken so far as they agree with the authority of the Upanishad, and when when they disagree, they are to be rejected without mercy. This we ought to remember always, but unfortunately for India, at the present time, we have forgotten it. A petty village custom seems now the real authority and not the teachings of the Upanishad. A petty idea current in a wayside village in Bengal seems to have the authority of the Vedas and even sometimes or some things better. That words that word orthodox, how wonderful its influence to the villagers. The following of every little bit of the karma kand is the very height of orthodox, and one who does not do it is told, go away, you are no more a Hindu. So there are most unfortunately in my motherland persons who will take up one of this tantra and say that the practice of this tantra is to be obeyed. He who does not do so is no more orthodox in his view. Therefore, it is better for us to remember that in the Upanishad, in is the primary authority. Even the Grihya and Shrota Sutra, Shrota Sutra are subordinate to the authority of the Vedas. They are the words of the rishis, our forefathers, and you have to believe them if you want to become a Hindu. You may even believe the most peculiar ideas about the Godhead. But if you deny the authority of the Vedas, you are the Nastik. Therein lies the difference between the scriptures of the Christians or the Buddhists and ours. There are all Puranas and not scriptures because they describe the history of the deluge and the history of the kings and the reigning families are record the lives of the great men and so on. This is the work of the Puranas, and so far as they agree with the Vedas, they are good. So far as Bible and the scriptures of the other nation agrees with the Vedas, they are perfectly good. But when they do not agree, they are no more to be accepted. So, with the Quran, there are many moral teachings in this, and so far as they agree with the Vedas, they have the authority of the Puranas, but no more. The idea is that the Vedas were never written. The idea is they never came into existence. I was told once by the Christian missionary that their scriptures have a historical character and therefore are true, to which I replied, mine have no historical character and therefore they are true. Yours being historical, they were evidently made by some men and the other day. Some men the other day. Yours are man made, and mine are not. Their non historicity is in their favor. Such is the relation of the Vedas with all the other scriptures as present day. We now come to the teaching of the Upanishad. Various texts are there. Some are perfectly dualistic, while others are monistic. But there are certain doctrines which are agreed to by all the different sects of India. First, there 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 is the doctrine of or reincarnation of the soul. Samskara. First, there is a doctrine of samskara or reincarnation of the soul. Secondly, they all agree in the psychology. First, there is the body. Behind that, what they call the Sukshma Sharir, the mind, and behind that even is the Jeev. That is the great difference between West and Indian psychology. In the West, the mind is the soul. Here, it is not. The antakaran, the internal instrument, has the mind is called, is only an instrument in the hands of that jiva, through which the jiva works on the body or on the external world. Here, they all agree, and they all also agree that this jiva or atma, jivatma, has it is called by the various sect. is eternal without beginning, and that it is going from birth to birth until it gets final release. They all agree in this, and they also all agree in one other most vital point, which alone marks characteristically, most prominently, most vitally the difference between the Indian and the Western mind. And it is this, that everything is in the soul. There is no inspiration, but properly speaking, expiration. All powers and all purity and all greatness and everything is in the soul. The yogi would tell that the siddhis, anima, lagima, and so on that he want to attain are not to be attained in a proper sense of the word, but are already there in the soul. The work is to make them manifest. Patanjali, for instance, would tell you that even in the lowest worm that crawls under your feet, all the eightfold yogis' power are already existing. The difference has been made by the body. As soon as it gets a better body, the powers will become manifest. But they are always present, or they are there.